There's something almost, well, magical about the idea of talking trees, isn't there? It's such a classic trope from fairy tales and myths. These wise ancient beings whispering secrets in the forest, the boughs heavy with like unspoken wisdom. We've all encountered them in stories, felt that sort of flicker of wonder, right? But what if we told you that in a really profound, astonishing, and even scientifically validated way that ancient intuition might not be so far from reality after all?
It's true, actually. It sounds like fantasy, but the science is increasingly pointing in that direction. Today, we're embarking on a journey beneath the forest floor and really far beyond that to explore this hidden, intricate world of tree communication. We'll uncover how trees really do communicate through these astonishingly complex underground fungal networks and sophisticated chemical signals. This isn't just some quaint notion anymore. It's a rapidly evolving field of scientific discovery that's fundamentally reshaping our understanding of life itself.
Yeah, and it's more than just a fascinating biological fact, isn't it? Our mission for this deep dive is really ask, what does this incredible natural intelligence, this cooperation, reveal about connection in nature? And perhaps most crucially for us, what profound lessons might humans learn from it? Especially as we navigate our increasingly digital and, let's face it, sometimes intensely disconnected lives. Can nature, in its quiet, ancient wisdom, truly teach us something essential about, say, emotional and social intelligence in our modern world?
Well, that's exactly the question we want to explore. And for this exploration, we've drawn from an incredibly rich set of sources, really fascinating stuff. We'll be diving into groundbreaking scientific research, the kind that has literally traced the pathways of communication between trees. Then there are the compelling observations of a German forester, Peter Wohlleben, who's become a publishing sensation by making this complex science really accessible and engaging. We'll also look through the expansive philosophical lens of biosemiotics, which fundamentally challenges how we even define intelligence and meaning in the first place. And we're even tapping into a vibrant online discussion from people sharing their deeply personal experiences of communing with nature. So yeah, prepare for some truly eye-opening revelations, maybe even a reevaluation of what it means to be connected.
Okay, let's really try to unpack this revolutionary idea. Because for a long, long time, especially, since Darwin, the prevailing view of trees was pretty stark,
Mhm.
really different. They were largely seen as these disconnected loners, right? Fiercely and constantly competing for vital resources like water, essential nutrients, precious sunlight, just individuals fighting it out. If you talk to someone in, say, the traditional timber industry, for example, they often describe forests as these intense, almost cutthroat battlegrounds where only the fittest, the most aggressive can possibly survive. It's a very competitive image, isn't it? A kind of arboreal, every tree for itself mentality.
That's precisely right. And that traditional competitive model didn't just influence how we viewed forests. It deeply informed and shaped our actual forest management practices for decades. It really reinforced the notion that individual trees were just isolated entities, each one vying for every drop of water, every ray of sunshine, every available nutrient. The implication was, well, if you want a healthy forest, in that view, you either let nature take its course in this brutally competitive way, or you actively intervene to remove the weak ones to favor the strong.
But our sources suggest we need to seriously challenge that ingrained idea. Peter Wohlleben, the German forester and author of that incredibly popular book, The Hidden Life of Trees, he observed something completely different, something far more nuanced and, frankly, cooperative in his own forest. He tells the story of two massive beech trees, describing them almost like old friends. He noticed their crowns, way up high, were remarkably careful not to encroach into each other's space. They maintained these distinct but adjacent boundaries. And critically, he found that their root systems were intimately connected below ground. But here's where it gets truly poignant, I think, and really eye-opening. Volobin observed that if one of these friend trees were to die, the other would often follow soon after. That suggests a deep, undeniable interdependency, right? A shared fate almost. It absolutely flies in the face of that traditional dominant survival of the fittest narrative we've applied so broadly, maybe too simplistically, to forests.
Yes, and what's truly fascinating here is how Volovan's anecdotal observations, which came from decades of direct, hands-on experience managing forests, didn't just stand alone. They really resonated with and were later powerfully supported by rigorous scientific findings that began to emerge around the same time or shortly after. He was describing this nuanced cooperative relationship that our prior, maybe more reductionist scientific models often overlooked or simply weren't equipped to even detect. It speaks to the power of careful long-term observation, doesn't it? Even before we had all the sophisticated tools to prove the exact mechanisms.
Right. So if they're clearly not just competing, if there's this profound level of connection and mutual support going on, what exactly is happening beneath the surface that allows for this? How are they so intimately linked?
This is where the truly amazing science happens, and it's something that people have started calling Earth's natural internet. And it's not really an exaggeration. Essentially, all the trees in a healthy, mature forest are connected through these vast, incredibly intricate underground fungal networks. Specifically, they're called mycorrhizal networks. These networks are made up of the fine, hair-like root tips of trees joining together in a symbiotic relationship with microscopic fungal filaments called mycelium. If you were to try and picture it, imagine the mycelium as like the fiber optic cables of the forest, weaving this unbelievably intricate, almost boundless web beneath our feet. It connects nearly every living thing in the soil, trees, shrubs, fungi, and microbes. It's a vast living network.
So it's not just a few random connections here and there, it's an entire interconnected system, almost like a living, breathing web under the whole forest floor.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
A biological internet. And Suzanne Simard, who's a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, she's done extensive, truly groundbreaking research that has literally mapped these networks. Her team's pivotal experiment, the really famous one, used radio-labeled carbon dioxide. That's a traceable isotope, right? So they could track exactly where it went, almost like putting a tiny GPS tracker on a sugar molecule. They injected a donor tree, typically a large, healthy one, with this altered CO2 to let it photosynthesize, creating sugars with this traceable carbon. And what they found was truly profound. These donor trees actually sent those carbon-rich nutrients through the fungal network to shaded trees nearby that couldn't photosynthesize enough on their own. This wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a visible, measurable transfer of life-sustaining resources.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a profound discovery, proving beyond doubt that trees communicate their needs, and critically, they act on that information to support others, particularly the struggling younger ones.
Wow, so they're literally sharing food, sending vital nutrients directly to those in need. That's an absolute game changer for how we think about forests, isn't it? It fundamentally shifts the perspective from just ruthless competition to something far more cooperative. It sounds like a true symbiosis, a mutually beneficial partnership.
It absolutely is, and it's a remarkably efficient economic exchange if you want to think about it that way. The fungi, which are the primary architects and the conduits of this network, they don't work for free. It's a two-way street. They consume about 30%, sometimes more, of the sugar that trees produce through photosynthesis. That's their energy source. But in return, these fungi, with their vast network of tiny filaments much finer than tree roots, they act like microscopic prospectors. They scavenge the soil far beyond the reach of the tree roots themselves, finding essential mineral nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and even water, which are then absorbed by the trees through the fungal connection. Without this crucial fungal partnership, trees would struggle immensely to access these vital elements, which are often locked up chemically in the soil or just very unevenly distributed. It's a total win-win. Both sides provide something the other desperately needs to thrive.
So the fungi get their sugar fix, their energy, and the trees get their critical minerals and water delivered right to their roots. Everyone wins and the whole forest thrives because of it. But I've heard about some trees being even more important in these networks, sort of playing a central role. Can you tell us more about that, the mother trees?
Absolutely, yes. Within these vast interconnected networks, the oldest and largest trees, which Samard has affectionately dubbed mother trees or sometimes hub trees, they play an absolutely critical role. They're incredibly important. They're not just big, they're like the central servers or maybe the matriarchs of the entire forest community, the main communication hubs. They literally suckle young saplings that are growing in deep shade by pumping sugar directly to their roots, sometimes for years. These young trees, lacking enough sunlight to photosynthesize effectively on their own, would often just perish without this life-sustaining pipeline from the established mother trees.
That's amazing. They're feeding the babies.
Exactly. And Volbin's observations further highlight this. Remember that forester? He found a gigantic beech stump felled centuries ago that was still green with chlorophyll. Remarkably, still alive, capable of limited photosynthesis. The only possible explanation was that the surrounding living beeches were actively keeping it alive by continuously pumping sugar to it through the network.
Wow. After centuries.
Centuries. He compares them to elephants, reluctant to abandon their dead kin. It's a powerful metaphor, suggesting a deep communal bond that transcends even, well, what we consider death for an individual tree. And beyond just sugar, these mother trees also use their deep, extensive roots to draw up water from lower soil levels, making it available to shallow-rooted seedlings nearby. Plus, they seem to detect distress signals from struggling neighbors, maybe chemical signals, and increase nutrient flow accordingly. It's an incredible level of support, communication, and care within the ecosystem, far beyond what we traditionally imagined.
That's truly astonishing. I mean, just picturing a tree stump from hundreds of years ago still being kept alive by its community, it fundamentally makes you rethink what it means to be alive, what it means to be connected within an ecosystem. But how exactly do these messages, these distress signals, or maybe requests for sugar, how do they travel through this vast underground web? What's the actual language they're using to coordinate such complex actions?
Yeah, that's the next fascinating layer. And it's still an evolving area of discovery. Trees use a whole variety of sophisticated signals, and they're far more complex than just simple on-off switches. First, and perhaps the most widely studied, are the chemical and hormonal signals. Trees send these chemical compounds not just through the underground networks, but also through the air. Often these are very precise distress signals about things like drought, disease, or insect attacks. And these signals prompt other trees, even those not yet attacked, to alter their behavior, maybe ramp up their defenses, conserve water, that sort of thing. It's a proactive, distributed defense system for the whole community.
So it's like an early warning system that spreads through the entire forest, almost like a chemical alarm bell, allowing trees to prepare their defenses before a threat even reaches them directly.
Precisely, exactly that. A classic and really vivid example happens in the African savanna with acacia trees. When a giraffe starts munching on the leaves of an umbrella thorn acacia, that tree doesn't just sit there passively. It starts emitting ethylene gas, an airborne distress signal that carries on the wind. Nearby acacias detect this gas, and in a remarkably rapid response, they start pumping tannins into their own leaves. Tannins are these bitter compounds that can sicken large herbivores, like giraffes, if they eat too many. It effectively makes their leaves unpalatable or even slightly toxic.
So the giraffes evolved to know this. They're getting the memo from the trees and adapting their behavior accordingly. That's incredible coevolution.
They certainly are, and it's a brilliant example of that coevolutionary arms race.
Yeah.
Giraffes, having evolved alongside acacias for millennia, have learned this natural defense mechanism very well. This is why they've learned to browse into the wind, usually. So the warning gas doesn't reach the trees ahead of them and trigger their defenses before the giraffe gets there.
Clever.
Very clever. And if there's no wind, a giraffe will typically walk at least 100 yards, sometimes more, before feeding on the next acacia tree. They seem to intuitively know the gas won't travel that far in still air. It's this ongoing dance of communication, adaptation, and counter-adaptation.
That's incredibly specific and detailed. It's almost like the trees have a sense of smell or maybe even taste in a way we're only just beginning to truly understand and appreciate.
Indeed. And it gets even more nuanced. There's research showing that when elms and pines are attacked by caterpillars, they don't just react generically. They can specifically detect the caterpillar's saliva, a distinct chemical signature. Upon detecting that specific saliva, they release specific pheromones into the air that act like a beacon, attracting parasitic wasps.
No way.
Yes. These wasps then come along and lay their eggs inside the caterpillars, effectively turning the tree's attacker into a living incubator, a food source for their larvae. As Willoughby Riley puts it, this is very unpleasant for the caterpillars and very clever of the trees.
That's brilliant biological warfare.
It really is. And the discrimination continues. Other studies show trees can even differentiate between deer saliva on a broken branch, which triggers the production of defensive chemicals to deter further browsing, and the clean break from, say, a human snapping a branch. The human break triggers healing substances to quickly seal the wound, not defensive ones. They seem to differentiate between a deliberate threat and an accidental injury, suggesting a highly sophisticated level of perception.
That's absolutely wild. They can tell who broke the branch. So they're not just reacting blindly. They're actually interpreting the nature of the interaction.
It certainly appears so, yes. It suggests a much more active awareness, maybe, than we once attributed to them, a more nuanced response system. Furthermore, other studies have shown that in crowded conditions, plants secrete chemicals into the soil that can prompt their neighbor to grow more aggressively to avoid being shaded like a competitive spurt. Or, conversely, they might exhibit what's called canopy shyness, where they literally rein in their growth under crowded conditions, maintaining these distinct spaces between their crowns even when they could physically touch. It demonstrates different, seemingly strategic approaches for managing competition within these dense communities. And perhaps most remarkably, research also suggests they can detect strangers versus kin, genetically related neighbors, through these incredibly subtle root-secreted chemicals.
Kin recognition.
In trees.
Yes, showing a form of recognition that influences whether their behavior leans more cooperative or more competitive. Okay, so beyond these fascinating chemical signals, are there other forms of communication happening? You mentioned something earlier. Are we talking about something that hints at a plant nervous system?
Well, that's a really fascinating frontier in plant science. And yes, scientists are just beginning to decipher electrical signals in plants. Edward Farmer at the University of Lausanne has identified a voltage-based signaling system in plants that is strikingly similar in its function to animal nervous systems. Now, it's really crucial to emphasize that plants don't possess neurons or brains as we understand them, no centralized processing centers. But the similarities in the rapid long-distance transmission of information through electrical impulses are incredibly compelling.
So what did his research actually reveal about this electrical communication? How does it work?
His team observed that when Egyptian cotton leafworms started eating the leaves of Arabidopsis thaliana, that's a common model plant in research, voltage changes radiated out from the damaged site within seconds. And these electrical signals rapidly led to the accumulation of defensive compounds, even in leaves far away from the initial injury. It wasn't just a localized response. What's more, the genes involved in generating and propagating these plant electrical signals are evolutionary analogs, meaning they share a common ancestry with genes that animals use for sensory signals and nervous system function.
Wow.
It suggests incredibly deep shared origins in the fundamental mechanisms of life for sensing and responding to the environment. When a tree is cut, for example, other research shows it sends electrical signals that bear a remarkable resemblance to the pain signals or wound responses observed in human tissue. It's not a nervous system in the animal sense, but it's clearly a very rapid systemic form of information transfer, coordinating a whole plant response to threats or damage.
And I've even heard whispers about sound. Is that really true? Are trees actually crackling to each other down there? It sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel.
Yeah, this area is definitely more speculative and still in the early stages of research. It needs more investigation. But Monica Gagliano at the University of Western Australia has gathered some intriguing evidence suggesting that some plants may also emit and detect sounds. Specifically, she's observed a very subtle crackling noise emanating from the roots of some plants at a frequency around 220 hertz, which is completely inaudible to human ears. This field is still developing, right? And the precise communicative function of these sounds, if it's confirmed and widespread, is yet to be fully understood. We don't know what information they might carry. However, it just opens up even more profound possibilities for how intricately connected, aware, and multidimensional the natural world might truly be.
So putting it all together, trees are communicating with this astonishing array of signals. Chemical warnings flying through the air and seeping through the soil, complex nutrient transfers happening underground via fungi, rapid electrical impulses coordinating defenses, and maybe, just maybe, even subtle sounds. It's far more complex, far more intelligent, and vastly more interconnected than I think most of us ever imagined. But what does this truly mean for our broader understanding of intelligence and life itself, particularly in the context of nature, especially if it's not limited to creatures with brains like ours?
This is precisely where the groundbreaking field of biosemiotics comes into play. It's a fascinating approach. It's really dedicated to building a crucial bridge between traditionally separate disciplines: biology, philosophy, linguistics, even communication sciences. At its core, the main idea, as articulated by its founding scholar Thomas A. Seebeck, is that life and semiosis, which is essentially the process of sign exchange or the creation and interpretation of meaning, are coextensive. They happen together. In essence, biosemiotics posits that wherever there is life, there are signs carrying meaning, and life itself is fundamentally defined by this ongoing process of meaning-making and response.
Okay, hold on. So it's about understanding how meaning isn't just a human construct like language or symbols, but is actually created and interpreted across all living things, from the smallest cell right up to the largest forest. That's a pretty profound shift in thinking.
Exactly. It really is. Seebeck argued that signs carry meaning, and perhaps more controversially for some traditional scientists, that life itself inherently carries mind-like properties. Not consciousness necessarily, but properties that enable the meaningful interpretation of perceived signs. This outlook contrasts sharply with the traditional scientific dualism that has historically separated mind and matter. viewing consciousness as some kind of emergent property unique only to complex, brain-endowed organisms like us. Biosemiotics, instead, explores the gradual emergence of qualities we associate with life and mind throughout nature, suggesting more of a continuum rather than a sharp, absolute division between thinking and non-thinking things. It suggests a deeply embedded intelligence, maybe not conscious in our human sense, but purposeful in its responsiveness to its environment.
That's a huge shift from our typical human-centric view, isn't it? It implies we're definitely not the only ones processing information in a meaningful way. That intelligence can manifest in forms far beyond what we typically recognize or even value.
And that's a crucial point they make. This perspective emphasizes that these mind-like properties in nature can be, and likely are, vastly different from the human mind.
Yeah.
It deliberately tries to avoid anthropomorphism, attributing human traits like specific thoughts, emotions, or conscious intentions to non-humans. Instead, it acknowledges the immense diversity of sign exchange across all levels of biological organization. From the incredibly complex signaling happening within a single cell, to the intricate communication between individual organisms like trees and fungi, right up to the vast interconnected dynamics of entire ecosystems. It's about recognizing distinct forms of intelligence, distinct ways of processing meaning that are appropriate to the organism and its environment.
So it's not about saying trees have brain or feel sadness like humans do, but it is about recognizing their own unique, sophisticated ways of processing information, interpreting signs from their world, and responding in ways that are meaningful to their survival and flourishing.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. A core concept here is the Umwelt, which was developed by the biologist Jakob von Uexküll back in the early 20th century. The idea is that the healthy development of any organism, whether it's a human child, a bee finding nectar, or a plant responding to sunlight, presupposes an environment rich in signs that meet its specific requirements. Each organism then selects what is meaningful to it from that environment, filtering out the irrelevant noise, and thereby constructs its own subjective world, its unique perceptual reality, its Umwelt.
Okay, give me an example.
Okay, think about it like this. A dog experiences the world primarily through scent, right? Its Umwelt is this incredibly rich landscape of smells, filled with stories and signals that we humans can barely register, if at all. A bat's Umwelt is a world of echoes and sounds, a sonic topography where it navigates and hunts in complete darkness. While we humans share the same physical space with the dog and the bat, our perceived realities, our Umwelten, are vastly different, shaped by our unique sensory apparatus and needs. Our world is dominated by vision and maybe sound. So, for a tree, its Umwelt is defined by that unseen network of chemical and electrical signals, the subtle changes in light quality from above, the specific vibrations of the soil, the presence of kin or strangers through root exudates. It's about how each organism uniquely maps its reality based on what it can perceive and what's meaningful to its survival and flourishing within its particular niche. And importantly, organisms aren't just passive recipients of this information. They actively reshape these sign relations. They influence how they recognize and respond, and they even change the sign relations in other species around them, like the acacia and the giraffe. In the big picture, through these intricate webs of meaning and perception, we all profoundly affect each other's Umwelten.
This sounds almost like a form of collective intelligence, or at least a highly sophisticated level of processing and interaction that really challenges our conventional definitions of what intelligence even is. But I know that not all scientists are comfortable with this. Not everyone agrees on how far these analogies should stretch, right?
Yeah.
It's a pretty big leap for some within the scientific community to move beyond purely mechanistic explanations.
You're absolutely right. That's very true. The idea of talking trees, plant intelligence, plant consciousness, these concepts have certainly sparked intense debate, even controversy, within the scientific community. Some prominent scientists, like Stephen Woodward from the University of Aberdeen and Lincoln Thais, who's a retired professor of plant biology at UC Santa Cruz, they caution strongly against what they see as potentially misleading anthropomorphic interpretations.
Okay, so what's their main argument? What's the core of their skepticism? Where do they draw the line?
Their central argument really revolves around intention. They acknowledge that trees emit distress chemicals, for example. That's established science. But they insist there's no intention to warn other trees. It's just a biochemical consequence, and other trees happen to pick it up. Thais, for instance, while finding Suzanne Samar's research fascinating and even outstanding for its empirical rigor, maintains he sees no evidence that interactions are intentionally or purposely carried out. He suggests that individual roots and fungal filaments are merely genetically programmed by natural selection to do their job automatically, like a kind of biological automaton. They don't require any overall consciousness or purposefulness directing the action. It's a very deterministic, purely mechanistic view of biological function.
So for them, the appearance of purposefulness or intelligence is kind of an illusion generated by complex automatic processes, like watching ants build a complex nest.
Exactly. That's a good analogy. Thais is willing to go along with the idea that trees might exhibit what he calls swarm intelligence, similar to an ant colony or a flock of birds. But he believes applying terms like consciousness or purposefulness to trees doesn't actually add to our scientific understanding. He worries it can lead down erroneous paths towards what he calls tree consciousness, which he sees as unsupported. He views the appearance of purposefulness as an illusion, maybe comparable to the concept of intelligent design in evolution debates. He argues that natural selection and genetic programming can fully explain everything we currently know about plant behavior without needing to invoke any form of mind or intention. Richard Forday, a paleontologist, expresses similar sentiments. He dismisses the mother tree concept, for example, as so anthropomorphized that it's really not helpful scientifically. He states that trees solve problems under purely hormonal control, a system evolved through natural selection, and they have no will or intention behind their actions. He even states he's appalled by any talk of a spiritual aspect to these biological interactions, fearing it dilutes scientific rigor and objectivity.
It sounds like they're really worried about humans projecting too much onto nature, perhaps because of our own, historical susceptibility to myths and our innate desire to find meaning and agency in the world around us. Is that part of it?
Yes, Thais explicitly articulates that concern. He believes humans are fatally susceptible to the mythology of thinking, feeling, speaking trees. He points to examples like ancient prophecies about sacred groves, old tales of leprechaun gold hidden under trees, even Hollywood films depicting sentient forests like an Avatar or Lord of the Rings. He sees this deeply ingrained human impulse driving the immense popularity of Volobin's book, which became a global bestseller, and Simard's TED Talk, which garnered millions and millions of views. Forty seems to concur, stating that Volobin describes trees as if they possess consciousness and emotions, even comparing them directly to Tolkien's Ents, those walking, talking tree-like beings. Their core concern seems to be that this emotional, narrative-driven language, while undeniably appealing to the public, risks misleading people about the true nature of scientific discovery and the limits of our current understanding.
So how do Peter Volobin and Suzanne Simard, the figures really at the center of popularizing this new understanding, how do they respond to this kind of scientific skepticism and the criticism about their use of language?
Well, Peter Volobin acknowledges the criticism directly. He knows scientists who insist on language that is purged of all emotion, language that is strictly objective, precise, and, well, maybe sterile. He counters that this purely objective approach, while scientifically necessary in some contexts, is inhuman when communicating to a broader audience, and frankly, extremely boring for most people, failing to capture the wonder and complexity of the natural world. His stated purpose, he emphasizes repeatedly, is not to claim trees have human consciousness or emotions. Instead, it's to make the underlying science accessible and engaging for everyone. He uses evocative emotional storytelling, saying things like, trees cry out with thirst, they panic and gamble and mourn, not as literal scientific claims of tree emotion, but as literary devices, as metaphors, to convey the profound mystery and intricate life of the forest. Ultimately, his goal is to inspire people to connect with nature on a deeper level, and importantly, to defend forests from destructive logging practices. He's clear he doesn't claim trees have a conscious life like ours, but he believes strongly that we must at least talk about the rights of trees and manage forests sustainably and respectfully. He sees himself as a kind of spokesman for these often overlooked beings.
Okay, that makes sense from a communication perspective. And Samard, how does she feel about this persistent reductionist approach that's common in Western science?
Suzanne Simard expresses a palpable frustration with Western science's prevailing reductionist tendency. She said things like, we pick it apart and study one process at a time, even though we know these processes don't happen in isolation. She feels that by fragmenting nature into these isolated components for study, science often misses the spirit of the whole thing, everything working together in harmony, the very essence of how an ecosystem functions as an integrated system. She acknowledges that we currently lack the scientific tools to fully map or measure that complex, holistic interconnectedness in its entirety. But she deeply feels its reality from her decades of research in the field. And to underscore the immense scale of this unseen world, she provides this vivid, almost mind-boggling detail. One single teaspoon of healthy forest soil, she notes, contains several miles of fungal filaments, miles in a teaspoon. It just illustrates the sheer, unfathomable complexity we are only beginning to comprehend, and maybe why a purely reductionist view, while useful for some questions, might fall short in capturing the whole picture.
Right. So while the scientific community may rigorously debate the why and the how of tree communication, or the most appropriate language to describe it, the overwhelming evidence for intricate connection and cooperation beneath the forest floor seems pretty undeniable at this point. This raises a really profound question, doesn't it? Why do they cooperate so extensively? Why share precious resources and form these complex alliances, sometimes even with other species, when the traditional interpretations of natural selection often emphasize relentless, individualistic competition for survival?
This is precisely where Simard offers a compelling and actually quite evolutionarily sound argument against the resource-grabbing individualist theory as the dominant force. She posits that it simply doesn't make long-term evolutionary sense for trees to be entirely self-serving in a forest context. Why? Because trees live longest and reproduce most often in a healthy, stable forest. This fundamental truth, that individual well-being is intrinsically tied to collective well-being in that environment, is why, she argues, they've evolved these complex cooperative behaviors to help their neighbors. Their individual survival, their ability to reproduce successfully and pass on their genes, their long-term flourishing over decades or centuries. It's all intimately tied to the overall health, stability, and resilience of the entire forest ecosystem they inhabit. It's an elegant, almost counterintuitive logic of nature where cooperation enhances individual fitness in the long run.
So profound disconnection or extreme individualism actually makes them more vulnerable in the end, not stronger. What happens to the forest if that cooperative system breaks down? If trees start acting purely as isolated individuals?
Exactly. The consequences of disconnection within a forest community are actually quite severe, and they cascade through the entire ecosystem. It's not good for anyone. If neighboring trees die, whether it's from disease, logging, drought, or climate stress, significant gaps open up in the protective forest canopy overhead. Now, while the remaining trees might initially get more sunlight and photosynthesize more sugar, they actually become far more vulnerable and, paradoxically, often become shorter-lived as a result.
Really? Why is that?
Well, the vital mycorrhizal support system, the fungal network connecting them all, weakens substantially without its numerous nodes and pathways. It becomes fragmented. The forest floor then loses its cool, damp microclimate. It gets hotter and drier, which is detrimental to the delicate fungal networks, the soil microbes, and the germination of young seedlings. Damaging winds can penetrate more easily into the forest, increasing the chance of individual trees being uprooted because they lack the collective stability provided by interlocking neighboring crowns and interwoven root systems. And perhaps most critically, as we discussed, the mother trees are a vital, almost irreplaceable defense system for the young. Their removal substantially diminishes younger tree survival rates, sometimes by as much as 4 times, according to Simard's research. So the forest's long-term resilience, its ability to withstand shocks like drought or fire and thrive over centuries, is fundamentally built on these profound interdependencies. Isolation weakens the whole system.
That's a really powerful argument for cooperation, demonstrating that isolation is actually a recipe for disaster in the long run for the whole community. But you mentioned something interesting earlier, a kind of cybercrime in nature. It's not all just peace and love down there, is it? Even in this cooperative network, there must be some, well, rogue elements or conflict.
You've hit on a fascinating counterpoint, and yes, it's true. The Wood Wide Web isn't entirely selfless and harmonious all the time. It's a complex ecosystem, much like our own human societies, right? It has its share of intricacies and even, as you say, things that look like cybercrime or cheating. For instance, there's a remarkable type of orchid, Erythrarchus altissima, that completely lacks chlorophyll. It cannot photosynthesize its own food at all. Instead, it survives entirely by stealthily plugging into the mycorrhizal network and stealing all its nutrients, sugars, minerals, everything from the fungi and the connected trees, without ever contributing anything back in return.
A true parasite on the network.
A true natural pirate, a biological freeloader that exploits the communal resource system. And on a more defensive or perhaps aggressive note, trees are not always just passive victims. They can also seemingly sabotage unwelcome invasive plants or competitors by spreading toxic chemicals, allelopathic compounds, through the network, effectively poisoning their unwanted neighbors. So while cooperation seems to be the dominant theme for long-term survival and stability, it's definitely a nuanced system with its own forms of exploitation, defense, and competition playing out simultaneously.
Right. So the incredible complexity and the mutual benefit and even the occasional cybercrime or defensive action within these natural systems, they offer such powerful metaphors for our own lives, don't they? So what can we as humans navigating this increasingly digital and often quite disconnected world truly learn from this deep dive into nature's intelligence and its intricate ways of being interconnected?
Well, for many thinkers, particularly those drawing from indigenous perspectives and critical ecology, the current climate crisis isn't just seen as an environmental issue in isolation. It's seen as highlighting a fundamental rupture in human history on the planet, a rupture largely driven by what's deeply analyzed as a culture-nature dualism.
Hmm.
This dualism, this idea that humans are separate from and inherently superior to nature, really gained significant traction during the Age of Enlightenment and was massively amplified by colonial processes starting way back in the 15th century. It essentially fostered a worldview where the environment became seen as an external thing, just a collection of resources out there to be used, manipulated, and ultimately exploited or destroyed purely for human gain and progress.
So it's a fundamental critique of how Western systems, particularly capitalism and colonialism, have historically approached and interacted with nature, a kind of philosophical error at the root of many of our current environmental problems.
Precisely. That's the argument being made. Indigenous voices around the globe strongly criticize this Western relationship with nature, which tends to treat the environment as a passive thing, an inexhaustible source meant purely for human consumption and wealth generation. They argue that even Western environmental laws, while often necessary and well-intentioned, frequently fall short of solving our ecological crises because of inherent flaws in their underlying philosophy. First, they're often fundamentally utilitarian, meaning they value nature primarily, sometimes only, for the services it provides to create human wealth. Think ecosystem services, carbon credits, etc. The modern concept of sustainability, while sounding positive, often falls into this trap from this critical perspective. It can end up seeing nature solely for its economic value, like maintaining timber yields or ensuring clean water for industry, which indigenous perspectives view as a fundamental fallacy that still objectifies and commodifies nature.
Interesting. And what are the other reasons these critiques suggest Western environmental laws often fail?
Secondly, these laws are seen as overwhelmingly anthropocentric, meaning centered solely on humankind. They are designed almost exclusively to protect human lifestyles, human health, and human economic interests. This often means inadvertently ignoring or even actively sacrificing the rights, the well-being, and the intrinsic value of other species or entire ecosystems themselves if they conflict with human desires. And finally, these critiques argue that Western systems are fundamentally lacking in respect and sacredness towards nature. The dominant capitalist and colonial system has, in this view, systematically eroded and often deliberately suppressed the deep ethical relationship of respect, reciprocity, and reverence with nature that characterized many pre-colonial and indigenous societies. The historical example often cited is Henry Ford's infamous failed rubber monoculture in the Amazon back in the 1920s, known as Fordlandia, as a cautionary tale. Ford tried to recreate a Michigan factory town and industrial plantation system right in the middle of the incredibly diverse rainforest. He cleared vast tracts to plant just one single species of rubber tree. The jungle, as the story goes, reacted with pests and diseases that completely overwhelmed the vulnerable monoculture, leading to its spectacular and costly failure. It was a stark lesson in the dangers of ignoring natural laws, biodiversity, interconnectedness, and the wisdom embedded in local ecosystems, all in favor of supposed industrial efficiency and top-down control.
Okay, so if those Western approaches are seen as fundamentally flawed by these critiques, what's the alternative view being proposed, particularly by Indigenous peoples?
In stark contrast, indigenous peoples across the world have, for millennia, generally viewed nature not as a thing or a collection of resources, but as a living entity, a complex system of relations, relatives, and responsibilities. Many are passionately advocating now for the personhood of nature, arguing for legal status to be granted to rivers, mountains, forests, and other natural entities, giving them inherent rights akin to human rights, allowing them to be represented in court, for instance. For them, humans are unequivocally part of nature, emphasizing that the two are equal and interdependent, not separate or arranged in a hierarchy with humans at the top. They prioritize cultivating a spiritual and deep relationship of respect and reciprocity, focusing on ongoing exchange and caring with the land and its beings rather than a purely extractivist mentality. It shifts the focus from what can nature do for us to what are our responsibilities to nature as part of the same family. It's about a balanced, reciprocal relationship of mutual care and responsibility. They often see themselves not as owners of the land, but as stewards or guardians for the land and future generations.
And this deep, respectful connection, this different way of relating, has very tangible, measurable benefits for biodiversity and climate, doesn't it? It's not just a philosophical ideal floating out there.
Absolutely. The evidence is really compelling and continues to grow. We now know that indigenous peoples, while occupying only about a quarter of the world's land surface, are astonishingly responsible for safeguarding around 80% of its remaining biodiversity.
80%.
80%. And their territories store over 20% of the world's forest carbon. Their traditional ecological knowledge and their ethics of reverence, reciprocity, and care make them, from this evidence-based perspective, demonstrably the best guardians of nature. And thankfully, this profound view is gaining significant traction globally, slowly but surely. Ecuador, back in 2007, and Bolivia in 2009 were absolute pioneers. They embraced the rights of nature right in their national constitutions, making it part of their fundamental legal framework. Since then, we've seen rivers in India and Bangladesh, a sacred mountain in New Zealand, ecosystems in Colombia, and other natural features elsewhere gain legal personhood status through court decisions or legislation. This merging legal revolution fundamentally challenges the dominant Western capitalist concept of property and ownership, affirming the deeper truth articulated by many indigenous cultures for centuries. We belong to Mother Nature. She does not belong to us. It's a powerful shift from possession to belonging to kinship.
That's fascinating. This deep, respectful connection isn't just about legal policy or abstract philosophy. It's really about a fundamental way of being in the world, a way of relating. And it seems many individuals today, even those completely outside traditional indigenous cultures, are actively seeking a similar kind of direct, personal communion with the natural world in their own lives. There's a real hunger for it.
Yes, that yearning for connection is definitely palpable. I saw a recent and very insightful discussion on Reddit, actually, exploring whether it's truly possible for modern people to commune with nature, and it revealed this wide spectrum of interpretations and deeply personal experiences. Many users define communication very broadly, extending it beyond human language to encompass things like reciprocal interactions with pets, feeling the mood of a place, or even interpreting large-scale events like climate change as the Earth way of communicating its distress to us.
That reminds me powerfully of that timeless quote from the physicist Max Planck. He said something like, "An experiment is a question which science poses to nature, and a measurement is the recording of nature's answer." It's a beautiful way to frame that dialogue, isn't it? As an ongoing conversation between humanity and the natural world, even through science.
It truly is a wonderful framing. Some users on that Reddit thread described experiencing profound moments of communing with nature while under the influence of marijuana or psychedelics. They reported feeling deeply spiritually connected, or having experiences where they felt trees quietly told them life lessons about growth, resilience, or interconnectedness.
Yeah.
Now, this raises a fascinating question, one that biosemiotics might try to tackle. Is this a literal direct interaction happening? Or is it the human brain, maybe under these altered states, becoming more receptive, less filtered, recognizing new patterns, and forming powerful, personally meaningful narratives from subtle environmental cues it normally ignores? One user recounted a really compelling anecdote. They had a struggling shrub in their garden that they felt was somehow telling them a nearby, much larger tree was stealing its water. They acted on this intuition, did some work around the larger tree's roots, and the shrub apparently recovered. So, regardless of the precise mechanism, whether it is intuitive insight, heightened perception, pattern recognition, or some form of true subtle conversation, it clearly led to a positive ecological outcome in their garden.
That's a compelling story, and ultimately it led to a positive outcome, and maybe that's the real test of any form of communication or understanding, isn't it? Does it lead to better relationship, better action?
Indeed. And this brings us back to that concept of Umwelten, the idea that animals, and presumably plants too, share the same physical environment but experience vastly different worlds because of their unique perceptual filters and needs. A naturalist participating in that online discussion described their scientific research not just as studying nature from the outside, but as actively tuning in to nature. This involves deeply immersing themselves in an environment, consciously eavesdropping on its sounds, keenly observing its subtle movements and changes, and trying to connect its myriad parts to truly understand what the plants and animals might be communicating to each other and to the environment. They described it as entering an altered state of mind even without drugs, achieved simply through intense concentration and sensory engagement. This tuning in involves a deep focus of all senses and a conscious effort to make connections that are typically overlooked in our fast-paced, often distracted modern lives.
So it's really about slowing down, radically slowing down, engaging all your senses, and really becoming present and receptive in the natural world, listening with more than just your ears.
Precisely. That seemed to be a very common theme. Many users on the forum discuss achieving this sense of communion through practices like mindfulness meditation, quiet observation in a natural setting, and deeply engaging all their senses, actively listening to the whisper of the wind through leaves, inhaling their rich scent of honeysuckle or damp earth after rain, feeling the warmth of the sun or the cool texture of moss on bark, touching plants with awareness and respect. This allows one to truly catalog the state of the world in real time, as one person put it, noticing subtle differences, connections, and changes that are often missed when we're rushing around or absorbed in our own thoughts. And a powerful overarching theme that emerged from these personal accounts was also the idea that humans are not separate from nature, that we are already an intrinsic part of it, and that the sense of separation many of us feel is perhaps an illusion, a construct perpetuated by our modern lifestyles and ways of thinking.
That's a profoundly non-dualistic perspective, isn't it? The idea that all matter, all energy is fundamentally connected, perhaps since the Big Bang. That we share the same cosmic origins, the same atoms with everything around us, the trees, the rocks, the air. One user put it beautifully, saying something like, "We are all just one insanely complicated chemical reaction. I am not separate from this earth. I am just a breath away. I drink the clouds." That's profoundly spiritual and deeply scientific alignment, isn't it? A real convergence of ancient wisdom and modern physics or ecology.
It absolutely is. Users describe this realization as so powerful and deeply spiritual, noting that we share our origins with everything in the universe. This non-dualistic view suggests that any perceived separation between humanity and nature is ultimately artificial, a kind of conceptual barrier that limits our understanding, our empathy, and our sense of connection. Another user described a core practice they used for communing with anything, really whether it was their food, other people, or nature. They called it adopting an opening up mental and emotional stance. This means consciously relaxing your internal tension, stepping back from judgment and preconceived notions, and simply being with your surroundings, allowing yourself to be affected by them. They found this leads to richer, more expansive experiences, less automatic judgment of things as good or bad, and an increased palpable sense of connection and belonging, whether it's with a meal, during a conversation, or sitting quietly in a forest.
That's really insightful. But what about technology in all of this? We often think of it as pulling us away from nature. Can technology also be a bridge, maybe, rather than just a barrier to understanding nature's hidden communications?
Surprisingly, yes, it seems technology can offer new windows into these hidden natural languages, perhaps even fostering a different kind of connection. There's a fascinating device I read about called Plant Wave, for instance. What it does is measure the subtle electrical pulses, those voltage changes we talked about earlier, in plants and mushrooms. It then translates these bioelectrical signals into audible music using a proprietary algorithm.
Music from plants.
Music from plants, essentially translating their electrical activity into sound patterns. The resulting sounds are often described by users as hauntingly beautiful or otherworldly. This device allows us to, in a sense, hear plant communication, or at least their bioelectrical activity, through wavelengths and frequencies normally completely beyond our human perception. It's literally giving a kind of voice to the seemingly silent world of plants. It suggests that, as one user in that discussion put it poetically, some witchcraft is just that which science has yet to find a way to explain. It bridges that gap between the unseen processes of life and something we can experience through our senses, revealing a layer of life we were previously unaware of.
These profound perspectives, they really span the gamut, don't they? From ancient indigenous wisdom and cutting-edge ecological science to these deeply personal, sometimes technologically mediated, revelations from everyday individuals. They all seem to paint this picture of connection, communication, and intelligence that operates far beyond our immediate human understanding and our typical ways of relating. So, bringing it all together, What is the ultimate takeaway for us as humans, particularly as we navigate our increasingly digital, sometimes isolating modern lives? How can we apply the wisdom of the Wood Wide Web to our own human existence?
I think the lessons from the tree's intricate interconnectedness offer incredibly powerful and potentially very actionable metaphors for our own human existence, especially now. Trees, as we've seen, thrive not as isolated, fiercely competitive individuals in the long run, but through these robust, cooperative networks of mutual support and resource sharing. They literally build a healthier, more resilient future for the entire forest by actively helping their neighbors, especially the vulnerable. And this stands in such stark contrast, doesn't it, to the potential for a profound disconnection, for filter bubbles, for echo chambers, and for social isolation that can so easily arise in our increasingly digital, often algorithm-driven spaces, where individual success or visibility often seems prioritized far above collective well-being or deep community connection.
So it's really about actively trying to apply that natural wisdom, those core principles of interdependence and reciprocity to our own human ecosystems, our families, our friendships, our communities, our workplaces, and yes, maybe even challenging ourselves to build healthier digital networks.
Exactly. I think that's the core message. The natural world, from the intricate symbiotic dance of trees and fungi beneath our feet, to the deeply relational, egalitarian, non-dualistic worldview held by many indigenous peoples, it consistently highlights the immense, undeniable value of reciprocity, mutual care, and prioritizing collective well-being. Suzanne Simard, when she talks about her ongoing Mother Tree project, she speaks not just of the scientific discovery, but of the personal motivation, saying she wants to give back what forests have given to me, which is a spirit, a wholeness, a reason to be. That spirit and wholeness she talks about, that's precisely what we as humans often seek in our own social and emotional lives, isn't it? Yet we frequently struggle to find or maintain it in a world that often emphasizes individualism, competition, and separateness.
Yeah, if trees literally prioritize the health of the entire forest for their own individual long-term survival and success, what does this tell us about the long-term health and resilience of our human ecosystems, our families, our communities, our companies, our online networks, if we consistently neglect genuine connection, mutual support, and the well-being of those around us? It's a really profound question to sit with, isn't it? One that perhaps points towards a fundamental flaw in our own modern operating system, or at least a critical area for improvement.
It absolutely does. The forest seems to show us quite clearly that isolated strength is often a dangerous fallacy in the long run. True, lasting resilience seems to be built primarily through connection, cooperation, and care.
Wow. Well, we've certainly journeyed deep into the unseen world of trees today. We've uncovered the incredible science behind their underground communication networks, their sophisticated chemical signals, and even those fascinating glimpses of their electrical and maybe auditory lives. We've explored how this intricate natural communication reveals a profound intelligence and cooperation that fundamentally challenges our often narrow, human-centric views. It's a concept beautifully articulated by things like biosemiotics, and importantly, profoundly lived and understood by indigenous cultures for millennia.
So that central question we started with. Can nature teach us something essential about emotional and social intelligence as we navigate our increasingly digital, sometimes disconnected lives? The answer, it seems, is a resounding and unequivocal yes, absolutely. It's a powerful living reminder that genuine connection, mutual support, reciprocity, and a broader understanding of belonging, of being an interconnected part of a larger whole, these aren't just pleasant ideals or feel-good concepts. They appear to be fundamental principles for survival, resilience, and flourishing, whether you're a humble tree standing in a forest, a vast and complex ecosystem, or a human being trying to navigate the complexities of the modern world.
So maybe as you go about your day, think about the Wood Wide Web, not just as a fascinating biological marvel happening under the ground, but perhaps as a potential blueprint, a metaphor for our own lives. How can we consciously cultivate richer, more reciprocal sign exchanges, more meaningful communication in our own human relationships and even in our digital interactions? How can we actively foster our own mycorrhizal networks of genuine support, empathy, and shared resources to avoid falling into the monoculture of disconnection, polarization, and isolation? How can we build collective resilience in a world that often seems designed to pull us apart? Perhaps, just perhaps, the secret to true emotional and social intelligence, the pathway to a more connected, resilient, and flourishing human existence, lies in remembering, deeply remembering, that we too are intricately connected parts of a much larger living system, and that our individual well being is ultimately and inextricably intertwined